Throughout history, there have been many titanic rivalries in the auto industry, from Chevrolet versus Dodge, McLaren versus Ferrari, BMW versus Mercedes. But one of the most fearsome rivalries ever was Down Under, involving Ford and the only manufacturer the Aussies could call their own, Holden. Believe it or not, Holden began way back in 1856, making horse saddles. But they were smart, these Holden engineers. So, when they realized the car was going to overtake the horse, they started making cars for Ford Australia. And by 1923, they were making 12,000 cars a year for those guys. But just 1 year later, they traded teams and became a permanent, exclusive GM body supplier in 1924. And then there was this thing called World War II. And that kind of disrupted things a little bit in Australia. But once that ended, they continued building GM cars for sale in Australia. But deep down, Holden didn't want to do that. They wanted to have a car built by Australians for Australians in Australia. So in 1948, they released the 48215, the most unoriginal name in the history of automaking. And, well, sure, it was basically a Chevrolet that they didn't want to sell in the US because it was too small. It was the first car designed by Holden. You see, Holden went over to Detroit, looked at that GM they didn't sell in America, reincorporated some design elements, and then put their badge on it. And it was the first car to wear Holden's badge. And it featured a 2.2-liter straight-six engine making 60 horsepower. Let's not get crazy here, fellas. But it didn't matter, because it was not designed for streets of Detroit or the avenues of New York. No, it was designed for the dusty hell of Australia. That meant it had a dust-proof body and a small turning circle, and just 2 years after its initial launch, it got a utilitarian version. Now over here we call it a pickup truck, but this isn't a pickup truck because it's based on a car. So it has the handling of a car and the body of a pickup truck. And since it's utilitarian, they gave it a clever nickname. The Ute. That's right, Holden gave Australia the first ever Ute in 1951, to much critical acclaim, and that is when Holden really began to take off. They made the FE series and the FB series, and people took notice. In fact, they became the first Australian car company with seat belts in the front. Not in the back, though, because those people don't matter, but in the front you had a seat belt. Yeah. They were also helped by Ford Australia's terrible reliability, which meant that in the dusty, bumpy automotive hell that is Australia, the Holdens would work, and the Fords wouldn't. And in 1968, the HK series was introduced, and Holden did something a little bit different. They made a halo car for it. They called it the Monaro, named after a very popular section of Australia. And it was designed with one goal in mind: win the Bathurst endurance race. What is the Bathurst endurance race? You take a bunch of stock cars, literal stock cars, like road legal, with license plates on them pretty much, put your factory colors on them, and then race each other, and whoever wins sells the most cars. It's pretty much as simple as that. And they didn't have anything for it, so they developed a Monaro. With a Coke bottle muscle car-esque design, it was incredibly good looking, and to back it up, it had a Chevy Source 5.7-liter V8 making 300 horsepower. And you know what? It worked. It gave Holden a victory at Bathurst in 1968. It gave Holden another victory at Bathurst in 1969. And in fact, it got a 1-2-3 sweep of the podium in 68. And a 550 horsepower version won the Australian Touring Car Championship in 1970. Speaking of the 70s, there were some issues with, like, gas and regulation being a pain. So, they had to detune it to meet emission standards, so it didn't have as much power. However, on the plus side, it was used in Mad Max. So there was a positive upside to everything. So, with the Monaro not being as powerful as it once was, the next car, well, I don't know. You would think it would be another standard issue sedan. It's the oil crisis after all. It would be tame, moderate, sensible. Or you could single-handedly revolutionize Australia's pop culture, but they wouldn't do that, right? Wrong! Enter the Sandman van. You see, Holden wanted to appeal to the youth. So, they took one of their utes, put a body on top of the bed to give it an enclosed cabin area, and throw a Monaro front end on it. Then you paint it in very bright, spectacular colors with the words Sandman on the back of it, and then you throw in a big old V8, just for good measure. And although it was only sold for 6 years, it became a cult following. You could put anything you want in the back of those vans. Surfboards, sofas, beds, speakers, anything, you could put it in the back and have a good party with it, okay? And the youth ate it up. So, fast forward a little bit to the end of the 1970s. The Sandman was gone. The Monaro was gone. But, on the plus side, the Holden Tirana hatchback was actually selling rather well. So, in order to make it sell a little bit better, they turned to motorsports again. You see, Ford was doing awfully well in Bathurst with their new Falcon XY. So, Holden couldn't let that happen unchecked, and they made 405 A9Xs. This was an options package, with big old fender flares to fit bigger tires, 4-wheel disc brakes, and a curb weight of just 2,600 pounds. That's pretty good. And it gets even better when you see that the 5-liter V8 made 263 horsepower and 320 pounds-feet of torque. In 1977, that is ridiculous. For comparison, the 6.6-liter V8 from the Trans Am of the same time period made 180 horsepower. Yeah. That was good enough for a 0 to 60 of 7.5 seconds. And with the incredible handling from the bigger tires and the disc brakes and the lightweight, and the power of the big old V8, it won back-to-back Australian Touring Car Championships and back-to-back Bathurst 1000 wins in 1978 and 1979. So I think it was pretty successful at its job. Around the same time of their Bathurst domination, they introduced their best-selling model, the Commodore. Now, no one has heard of the car it was based off of, the Opel Rekford, but everyone's heard of the Commodore, because it was a mid-size sedan. It wasn't a luxury big one like normal Holdens, and it featured a good little 5-liter V8, making 158 horsepower. Yeah, that's not ideal, but it didn't matter because it was incredibly rugged and durable. So to prove that it was rugged and durable, Holden entered the 20,000 kilometer Repco Round Australia trial. What is that? It's basically a race where you start on one end of the Australian continent, drive around the entire perimeter of the island of Australia, and then finish where you started. That is 12,000 miles through Australia's outback. That is not exactly hospitable terrain for any vehicle. And you know what? The Commodore finished 1, 2, 3 first try. And you know what? By 1984, they were getting some power in these things. The VK Commodore got a new aggressive appearance and a 237 horsepower V8 to match. But then, the government got involved and said, you need to run 91 octane fuel. But we don't have any engines with 91 octane fuel. Well, too bad. So, they contacted their friends at Nissan and bought some RB30T engines to put in the Commodores. That's right, we had a turbocharged straight 6 engine JDM Commodores. That's an R31 engine. And that wasn't even the craziest version. In order to compete in Group A touring car racing, Holden made an upgraded Commodore, 502 of them to be specific, all painted blue. And it had a upgraded 263 horsepower V8, fully functional aerodynamics, and better handling. And that led to the creation of their greatest asset, Holden Special Vehicles, HSV, baby. You see, they teamed up with Tom Walkinshaw Racing, you know, the Volvo touring car guys, yeah, that thing. Well, they made factory race cars for the road and for the track for Holden. And their first project was the VL Commodore. So, in order to win touring cars, they threw on a bunch of plastic bodywork and a good old 240 horsepower V8. Now, I should say, if you take the restrictor plate off of the V8 in road going, it adds about 60 horsepower to the engine just by doing that. So the engine was significantly under stressed than what it actually could do. Oh, and the bodywork, which looks very comical, like Batmobile-esque, and was often criticized for being plastic, it reduced drag by 25%. So it may look stupid, but if it works, it ain't stupid. This was the high point for the 90s in Holden. And by 2000s, they were getting a little bit bored, so they had to go a bit mad. And they took a VT Commodore, stripped out the body, and put a new coupe 2-door body on it, and called it the Monaro. Oh, and they threw in a Corvette engine making 400 horsepower. So we have a 2-door coupe sports car with a Corvette V8 in it that could do 0 to 60 in 5.2 seconds, and it had better suspension and better brakes. And people absolutely loved it. It was so good, it was not only exported to America as the Pontiac GTO, it was exported to Europe as well, called the Vauxhall VXR. And a little trivia bit about the Vauxhall. They put a supercharger on it, making 500 horsepower in 2001. That's ridiculous. And you know what? That was just the start of HSV's shenanigans. Because when the VF Commodore came out in 2013, it was given even more aggressive styling. And the base performance version had a frickin' LS3 in it. And this vehicle is notable for being the last winner of the Bathurst 1000 for Holden. At least so far, anyway. And HSV got their grubby little hands all over that thing. They put in a 6.2-liter supercharged V8, making 577 horsepower, and with an unrestricted top speed of 204. 204 miles an hour is nuts That is Audi RS7 CTS-V levels of speed. And if that wasn't crazy enough for you, there's only one option. Maloo. Basically, they took a HSV GTS Commodore, took the body off, and placed a Ute body on it. So we have a 577 horsepower Ute that can drift and is amazing and is one of the best vehicles in the history of the automobile, and you cannot change my mind on that. But it wasn't the fastest Holden. You see, it briefly held the record for the most powerful Australian production car until 2018, when HSV released the GTS-R W1. Only 300 of these things were made, and 170 grand a pop. Yikes, that's a lot of money. However, you do get a lot of bang for your buck on it. Because it's got a Corvette ZR1 engine, the LS9, making 640 brake horsepower. That was good enough for a 0 to 60 of sub 4 seconds, and a top speed of 211 miles an hour. AKA as fast as a Porsche 918. So in order to deal with this, they beefed up the suspension by 220%, gave it 6-piston brakes on all 4 corners, and a upgraded 6-speed manual transmission and carbon fiber air intakes to keep that engine nice and toasty cool in the Australian outback. So this is a proper super saloon, one of the fastest sedans in the world in terms of top speed, and it's also the last of its kind, because the Holden Commodore is dead. It was killed off in 2018, and that version marks the end of production, the celebration to what it was. And in fact, it's not just the end of the Commodore, it's the end of Holden. You see, literally 2 days ago, as I'm filming this, GM announced that they would pull the plug on the Australian brand, and that Holden would no longer exist by 2021, and shut its doors forever. Why? Despite all of the epic vehicles they made in the 90s, and 2000s, they couldn't keep their head above water, and the government constantly gave them subsidies because of GM forcing them to make rebadged versions of other GM products, and terrible government decisions that crippled their income. And eventually they just couldn't make enough profit to stay afloat, and GM pulled the plug on February 17th. And Holden's gone. It's the biggest automotive shutdown since Saab in 2010. It's a sad day, and I'm not even Australian. Because Holden was a car brand that the Aussies could call their own. It was built by Australians in Australia for the inhospitable landscape of Australia. And they rose to become one of the greatest driving cars ever made, making muscle cars and super saloons that could rival the best of Europe and America. And they may be gone forever, but some of their cars will live on in the history books forever.